looking forward to hopefully just really today sharing my thinking with you. What I've learned along my life journey, how I engage in systems thinking, what I'm continuing to learn and be fascinated by, and hope that along the way you leave here with more questions, because as we know, great systems thinkers really appreciate the questions more than the answers. So I don't have a lot of answers for you, but I do have some good questions, and I'm hoping that as you're really looking at questions, some of those questions will be, how can I challenge my own assumptions? How does what I'm hearing today and tomorrow at this conference really challenge some of the assumptions that I've held, and how is it going to make a difference in who I am and how I take action in my life? So let me ask you in terms of complexity, how many of you are experiencing more complexity in your life today than you were, say, 3 years ago? I think all of us are, as the world speeds up, as we become more interconnected, as we have more choices, more freedom, all of this really makes a difference in terms of the complexity that we're creating in our world. I was really inspired by the IBM study in 2010 that it was a study of 1,500 CEOs around the world that really identified that complexity was the biggest challenge they were facing, and the belief that this was not going to go away. What I thought when I saw that study was, oh my goodness, this is our opportunity to really get systems thinking out in the world, to create the kind of change that many of us have been hoping for, and to begin to tap into that connection between the experience of complexity, how challenging it is, how vulnerable it makes us, and to be able to invite some new thinking, some new ways of being in the world. So I've been learning a little bit about complex adaptive systems. I know that this community has a focus on systems dynamics as a way of approaching systems thinking, and it's a good one, and it's one approach to systems thinking. So I think we need to really think about how do we tap into a lot of the other system sciences that are out there that can also inform us, that can help us create new and different language and begin to help people move not just to systems thinking, but from systems thinking to also systems being. So complexity science is one that I'm playing around with, and I have a good colleague I met recently in my new home in New Mexico. His name's John Geckler, and he's been studying systems thinking along with Jeremy, who's also been studying complex adaptive systems for a number of years. So I've been learning a lot about complex adaptive systems, and I'm trying to see how I can bring it into my work in a way that it might make a difference. So when we think about complex adaptive systems, we're really looking at behaviors and characteristics that are nonlinear, and within any system, we need to really identify the agents and how the agents are really interacting. Complex systems are complex in terms of their properties, and one of the key factors is that they really can't be predicted and controlled, right? So when we think about how do we gather in a system here, we can try to predict what the outcomes are going to be, and many of our organizations really do spend a lot of time in that mode of trying to predict. But if we can really create a much more generative energy, if we begin to focus on what is it that we have the potential to discover, how do we learn to be with each other in ways that can really help us learn help us adapt, help us question. And one of the things I'm really appreciative of is the space that Shiraj and Susan and others are creating here that really helps us move into that space. Less predictable. We don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. We don't know what's going to happen by the end of the day. We didn't know yesterday what was really going to happen today. So, it's like this continual sort of unknown space that we get to play in. And in that unknown space, we have an opportunity to be adaptive, right? So that adaptive learning cycle begins to really kick in. And we see what kinds of input, what kinds of disruptions begin to really take us to that next level of thinking, that next level of understanding. So that complex adaptive systems are continually changing. We need to realize that all of our organizations, whether we're talking about families, and when I think of organization, I think of it very loosely. Anytime a group of people come together for some sense of purpose, we're an organization, whether it's 2 people, whether it's a whole community. It doesn't have to have a clear structure around it. It could be a very loose structure. But there's a lot of ways that we participate in organizations that are ways that we need to understand who we are as an agent within that system and how those systems begin to interact, how the agents within the systems interact. So when we think about complex adaptive systems, and this is this is a body of work that is unfortunately a little hard to access, right? Because it's highly scientific and it's not easy reading. But I think we can try to draw some of the principles from it that can inform who we are and how we interact. But when we think about the kinds of challenges it presents to us and the assumptions that it creates, we can just think about, for instance, the fact that behavior cannot be predicted or controlled within a complex adaptive system. How much time do we spend trying to measure, predict, control behavior in every system that we have created? Think about what's happening in education today. How much time do teachers try to control, predict, and really measure what's happening in those school systems to the point where nobody really cares anymore about learning, right? So what's happening? How do we begin to shift those assumptions about what's possible and what's not possible and begin to create new ways of understanding that can make a difference in how we engage as agents? One of the systems thinkers I think is particularly interesting to consider is Gregory Bateson. Bateson's work was really important in beginning to understand the relationship between people and our environment, right? And I would highly recommend, if you haven't seen it yet, this video, An Ecology of Mind, which was made by Gregory's daughter, Nora Bateson. And it really just brings this whole sense of sort of being in systems, the relational nature of our being, into a way that we can understand it, embrace it, begin to really think about who we are in these systems. I'll have to say that I have, through my doctoral study, I had a transformative learning experience. It was through my the philosophical embrace of hermeneutic philosophy that led me to believe and understand myself as a fully relational being. My belief at this point is that one of our major assumptions that keeps us from being able to change and adapt our systems to really serve us well and to protect the environment that we live in is the fact that we walk around believing that we're separate individuals. right? At our whole sense of psychology, of who we are, of how we adapt, in this culture particularly. Now every culture is a little different, but some cultures really believe themselves as fully relational beings. But in this culture, we tend to think of ourselves as separate individuals. We need to, in my belief, question that assumption. Begin to really see ourselves, feel ourselves as relational before we can really move to this sense of fully systems thinking, but systems being. How do we participate? That consciousness of who we are in any system, the consciousness of the actions that we take. There's some interesting science research being done on that whole nature of our relational way of being. So in this area of epigenetics, the reference here is to an article on the social life of genes. And what it is telling us, and the research that's being done right now, is that as you all sit in this room, as we sit in this room together, that our genetic expression is changing. It's changing constantly. We're adapting and changing to the environments that we're living in, that we're participating in. That what we think of as our DNA, while there's a general structure there that helps make up our personality, we're continually changing and adapting to those environments. But think about the challenge that Victor faces when he is working in these communities where the social relations that people are engaged in are not the positive kinds of relations that we're all engaged in. How are those relationships, those environments, changing the genetic expression of the individuals that are growing up there so that the children are not able to reach their potential because of the environments that they're living in? How do we change that when we really understand that to be true? So I think we need to really think about how our understanding of systems can make sense of complexity, how our understanding of a relational nature of being can make sense of the complexity and help us work in it. We really, as we begin to think of ourselves as relational, we obviously then begin to think about the kinds of actual contexts we live in. The fact that we want to create new context. Some of the factors that we need to consider in complex adaptive systems are the fact that we can pay attention to initial conditions, that how do we set the rules and the relationships in a way that begin to create the emergent behavior that we really desire. Just quickly, when we think about initial conditions, it's important to think about things like, do we have the variety, the requisite variety, the difference of perspectives, the difference of cultural understandings that are in any system? Pay attention to how much more alive a system is when there's a great amount of diversity in it. The kinds of conversations that occur, the kinds of interactions and relationships that occur. We need to focus on the identity. What's the purpose? What's the shared purpose that needs to emerge out of any system? How do we create a context for inquiry to be embedded as the heart of any initial and of any system so that it becomes a learning organization? And how do we create the trust that begins to really be embedded in the system in a way that people can engage in levels of inquiry and relationships that can really make a difference? We need to really look at the rules being simple rules, not complex rules, right? That enable distributed leadership, self-organization, some boundaries so we can really begin to create some sense of where we want to work, and coevolution, so we can really begin to be generative and co-creative. And we think of relationships, it's important to really think about how we're nested in systems, right? How systems are nested in other systems, so that it's not just a linear approach, but it's really beginning to understand the interconnections. This was a wonderful experience that I had in terms of working in a system where we were really, as a hospital system, we had a couple hundred people in the room. We were really beginning to look at how to engage people in a way that they understood as agents within that system, how they were contributing to the problem of keeping patients safe and what they could do differently to really begin to, through their relationships, through the way they communicated with one another, make a difference in really improving patient safety in the hospital. It was really an incredible event that made a difference in their lives. When we think about the kinds of polarities we're working with, we're really looking with, as Barry was talking about, we need to think about this movement from linear thinking to complex thinking in the way of how do these polarities interact. These are ones that are important to consider as we're doing the work that we want to do. And when we think about how do we influence a complex adaptive system, we're really looking at how we adjust the initial conditions, how we identify and clarify and modify the rules, and how we really focus on strengthening the relationships among the agents in the system. All of which present some very interesting challenges to management and leadership. Some of the questions I think we need to pay attention to. How do we place greater focus on relationships? How do we convene rather than control? How do we change the perceptions, the way people think, the way they see the world, in a way that can shift their behaviors? How do we pursue opportunities rather than try to be sure about what the outcomes that we want? How do we influence the whole and not micromanage the parts? And how do we seek variety rather than conformity? And so I'm going to leave you with these questions. I know my time's up, and I don't want to go over my time. And I think Gifford, at this point, who I want to introduce, and I'm so happy today that I had the opportunity to actually sort of be the link between two of some wonderful men that I've known for a long time. And Gifford has been an inspiration to me in his work and commitment to creating a sustainable world. Is going to talk a little bit about how we really move from two organizations that begin and create organizations and change organizations that can begin to make a difference in the world. So, Gifford.